everyone. Welcome to our first session of Trinity Term 2022 of the Oxford Jurisprudence Discussion Group. Today we have the pleasure to be joined by Professor Amalia Amaya Navarro. She is a British Academy Global Professor at the University of Edinburgh, among many other affiliations. Today we will be discussing her paper, Group Disagreement and Virtuous Deliberation in Law. So Amalia, welcome to the JDG. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks a lot. I should say, though, that my main affiliation, in addition to the affiliation to the University of Edinburgh, is the National Autonomous University of Mexico. I should just say that in all the events I participate, so I have this dual affiliation now, and it's really a pleasure for me to be here. This is one of the first events after all the in-person events came back, and before the pandemic, I was at the GDG just before all the in-person events were not possible anymore. So it's really wonderful to be here again with you. And I had a terrific session before the pandemic, and I'm looking forward to the discussion of my work here. Thanks a lot for the opportunity to discuss with you this afternoon. So what I would like to talk about is group disagreement today, and what resources we have, how could we address group disagreement by using the tools, the resources of virtue theory. So there are many types of disagreement in law, many types of disagreement that are relevant in law as well as in other domains. So one type of disagreement that has been very much discussed in epistemology particularly, but also in law, is peer disagreement. The disagreement among peers who have more or less equal evidence and a similar cognitive ability. So this is one type of disagreement, the disagreement that happens between two peers, for instance, two virtuous judges. There is also deep disagreement. Well, I'll leave this deep disagreement for later. There is also intrapersonal disagreement. So when one argues with oneself. So situations in which one is divided between two different courses of action or two different beliefs that are contradictory, and then one needs to argue the way out of the intrapersonal or internal disagreement. There is also group disagreement. So that is disagreement within groups. It can be institutional groups or it can be non-institutionalized groups. I will be focusing more specifically, of course, in legal decision-making groups, so groups that have the power to take legal decisions. And there is as well intergroup disagreement. So when you have two different groups that disagree, and this is a situation that is not quite the same as the peer disagreement in which you have two individuals. So it has its own distinctive complications. And there is a transversal category that is the category of deep disagreement that can affect, it can reproduce itself at all the different levels. So intrapersonal, in between two individuals, within a group, as well as in between groups. And this is the case of deep disagreement. So when the object of disagreement is a type of disagreement that is deep in the sense that it is pervasive, intractable, and according to some, like Vogelin, for instance, who was the first one in identifying the phenomenon, that cannot be addressed by rational means. The object of such a disagreement is like framework propositions, or it is a clash of normative perspectives such that there are at least doubts as to whether such disagreement can be rationally resolved. So there is a big landscape of types of disagreements, a variety of disagreement in law, which I think is a fertile terrain to be explored. And I don't think that there has been so much work, as far as I know, in trying to identify ways in which those different types of disagreement take place in the legal domain and how we could address them. So, of course, dealing with all these types of disagreement is beyond the scope of the paper and also beyond the scope of what we are able to discuss in one day. So I will be focusing only on group disagreement. So that will be my main focus, and only from the perspective of virtue theory. So I would like to suggest that virtue theory provides us some tools that are useful for dealing with the type of problems that occur when groups disagree. There is a question as to whether, which I will just flash it, and then maybe in the discussion we can go back to that. There is a question as to whether virtue theory can deal with disagreement at all, group disagreement of otherwise. So according to some people, is what can we do with virtue when it comes to disagreement? Nothing. There are serious problems with virtue theory as a tool for dealing with disagreement. Virtue theory, on the contrary, has a dismissive view of disagreement. Disagreement, if you disagree with a virtuous person, then this is a flaw of character. It's you because you are not virtuous. If there are two, it is even difficult to make sense, according to some, of the idea that two virtuous people could disagree. So if we cannot make sense of, except in terms of a flaw of character, of a virtuous person disagreeing with a non-virtuous one, and we cannot make sense of ways in which two virtuous people or two virtuous judges, for instance, could disagree, then it seems as if virtue theory has little to contribute to the topic of disagreement. To the contrary, I think that there is much that can be done with virtue theory, and what I will try to persuade you today is that it can be at least be useful to address one of these types of disagreement that are relevant in law, namely group disagreement. In terms of group disagreement, I will not deal with a whole bunch of problems that can happen when groups disagree, because there are very many issues that will need to be discussed. I will only explore the relevance or the utility of virtue theory to deal with problems of group disagreement that arise because of the operation of what are called deliberative distortions. So these are a kind of biases similar to the individual biases that we are all very familiar with that occur at group level. So just as we have biases at individual level, such as the self-serving bias or the confirmation bias, for instance, there are also biases that happen in group deliberation. These are deliberative failures or deliberative biases, and they impinge on disagreement in specific ways. So what I'm going to suggest is that virtue theory can help us deal with group disagreement specifically with those problems that occur because of the operation of deliberative biases. Okay? So let's then get started with that. And what I will do then is, first of all, I will explain a bit what are those biases, so what are those deliberative failures that put group deliberation at risk, and then what are the virtues that can be used to deal with those failures, so which are the kind of traits of character that are useful to correct those failures, and then if there is time, I will discuss some of the objections that can be raised against the claim that we can solve group disagreement by mitigating through virtue the import of these deliberative failures. Okay? So the first part then, which is the deliberative distortions. So in law, as in many other domains, decision-making power is allocated to groups oftentimes. In fact, in law, most of them, the most important... is someone keeping time? I didn't, sorry.
Yeah, but...
Yeah? Okay. Okay, well, so I have a tendency to talk too much, so let me just check. Yeah, okay. So we started at...
At 15, no? So
okay.
10.
Okay. Okay. So as I was saying, the groups often are endowed with decision-making power, and this happens in many domains. And those decisions that are particularly important are often allocated to groups rather than to individuals. There are good reasons for that. So like in law, the Supreme Court or the legislative commissions or the regulatory commissions and of course the parliament. So it is groups, appellate courts, courts of appeals, it is groups more often when it comes to the very serious momentous decisions that have to be taken in law that take those decisions rather than individuals. So it is especially important, I think, then to see whether virtue theory has something to say about group disagreement. What happens when those decision-making groups have to take a decision and cannot agree, okay? There is good reasons for allocating decision-making power to groups rather than individuals, and we are all familiar, I think, with the idea of the wisdom of the crowds. In the groups, we have reason to believe that groups take decisions better than those that will be taken by the individuals by themselves that constitute the group. However, even if the wisdom of the crowds might seem very persuasive, there are also oftentimes situations in which groups do not even as well as individuals, but even worse than the average median member of the group. So that is to say, if those individuals had decided by themselves in solitary deliberation, the decision would have been better than the decision that was taken by the group, okay? This is a problem, of course, because this goes against the whole spirit, the whole rationale of giving the decision-making power to groups rather than to individuals. What are the type of problems that are at the origin of these groups failing to have what is called a synergy? So it is called group synergy, is the idea that groups function better than individuals do. So what are the, I'm trying to find out, what are the type of problems that make it the case that there is no group synergy and that groups do worse than the average median member of the group? There are a number of deliberative failures, and there is good empirical evidence showing that groups systematically fall short because of those failures. And specifically, there is also, and I think this is interesting, empirical evidence concerning the legal decision-making groups specifically. So we should be worried about that, I think. The first one is amplification, which is the claim that when individuals deliberate within a group, the individual biases they have, like the self-confirmation bias, the confirmation bias, for instance, gets amplified. So it has that effect, that those individual biases, not all of them, but some of the individual biases we have, which are these systematic errors in individual reasoning, are amplified when we are in the context of a group rather than in solitary deliberation. Yeah? You were asking something? Ah, okay. By the way, if anyone wants to ask something, I'm going to have to wait until the end. Just ask. The second problem is the problem of suppression, which is the problem that groups do not take the decision that they would have taken in light of all the reasons that are available within the group, because some of the information that the individuals have is suppressed. It is suppressed because of two types of failure, and Cass and Stein explained that, I think, really nicely. Because of informational failures, because they think, if it happens that everyone in this group thinks between two candidates, if we are like picking someone for a scholarship, say something that perhaps will be more telling to you. If we are a decision committee and everyone thinks that A is better than B, but I actually think that B is better than A, but these people are more experienced than I am in this type of committee. It's my first time here, so probably I'm wrong. Probably A is a better candidate. So then I'm self-suppressing my views about what is the candidate that should get the scholarship because I don't trust in my judgment. This is informational reasons. But there are also other influences that are not informational but social. And it's when people suppress their own views within the group, not because they think that they are probably incorrect, but because they fear social sanctions, they fear being ridiculed, and this is particularly the case when it is a minority view. So because of these social influences, there is a social dynamic within the group that prevents these people from sharing information. Then there is the problem, in addition to amplification and suppression, of homogenization, which is due to common knowledge effects as well as cascades, when people, there is like a magnet of common information that prevents the rest of the information to play the role it should in the formation of the judgment. And there are also cascades, and we are all familiar with that, I think, in committees or even in groups when you decide who do you want to invite for the JDG. So it happens all the time that people reproduce whatever has been said before, as opposed to eliciting their own autonomous judgment. And this also means that there is an homogenization of the information within the group rather than the diversity that it could be have. The fourth one is polarization. And polarization happens when the deliberative tendencies that one has when coming into the deliberating room, the pre-deliberative tendencies, become more extreme as a result of deliberation. So deliberation has the opposite effect. Instead of bringing people together, they tear them apart. So you end up having more extreme versions of whatever it is that you thought before entering the deliberating room. And finally, and this polarization, I think that it is something that we can relate very easily as the political landscape now and the public debate is very much polarized, right? So we do have first experience, unfortunately, of that. And domination is the problem that happens when members of the attitudes of members of the deliberating group shift towards the attitudes that are held, the beliefs that are held by those members that are advantaged within the group. So in a group that is in which you have male and female, or in which you have cultural minorities, or if it is a senior group, but then you have a small, a junior person. So what happens is that there is this problem of domination in that the attitudes of everyone shift towards those that are held by the more senior person, the person who is socially advantaged, the man, or the person who is within the majoritarian cultural group. So this is the problem of domination. So as a result of that, the group does not benefit from all the reasons that are available within the group. And then we lose the advantages of giving the decision-making power to groups, okay? What happens is that the decisions are taken on the basis of only those small subset of reasons that have been shared. And furthermore, not all those that have been shared are equally inform the final judgment, but those that have been given or put in the table by the social advantage members or by the majoritarian opinion will have a pool that the others will not. So this is really a problem, and it's a problem that impinges in disagreement in different ways. So it is at the base of failures to agree. So when you have polarization, then there is this intensification of the disagreement, and this may yield to a failure to agree. Then with the other three amplification, less so, but with domination, suppression, and homogenization, what happens is that the agreement that is reached is not an agreement that is responsive to all the reasons that are available within the group, but is rather what I will refer to as a forged agreement or a pseudo agreement, a fake one. Because it is not that members agree, it's because they agree because some of the dissent has not been voiced or has not been taken into account. So it in fact is not a genuine agreement in that sense. So what could we do to prevent those deliberative distortions from arising and therefore to solve problems in which agreement is not reached or it is reached in epistemically objectionable ways and therefore it is not, it doesn't have epistemic value at the end? One way in which we could go is by cultivating the deliberative virtues. And I will say that this is not, of course, the only way to address these problems, but this is, I think, an important way in which we may do so. Which are the deliberative virtues? So these virtues are the traits of character that foster a genuine deliberation, that enhance group synergy, okay? And there are a number of those virtues. So we have epistemic virtues such as intellectual perseverance, intellectual honesty, intellectual courage, also moral virtues such as prudence or civility, kindness, okay? Also argumentative virtues such as willingness to question the obvious, a willingness to listen to others, to modify your position in light of other people's views. So these are argumentative virtues that have been studied very interestingly by argumentation theorists, and I think we can avail ourselves of that literature to complement what has been said about epistemic and moral virtues in law. And finally, we also have the communicative virtues, so such as sincerity or receptivity or clarity, which are also critical, of course, in context of group deliberation. So all these virtues I explain in the paper, there are interesting relations between them, so that they are not like a self-contained departments. There are interesting connections between these different types of virtues, and altogether the person who has a large share of those different virtues is what will be the ideally virtuous deliberator, okay? And if we have a group that is composed of virtuous deliberators, then, and this is my claim, those deliberative, we'll be in a better position to mitigate the deliberative failures or the deliberative biases that prevent groups that lead groups to fail to agree or that lead them in the direction of reaching agreements that are just pseudo agreements. How can they do that? Well, very briefly, and I will just give an example of each of them, of each of the different problems and how the virtues can correct those problems. In the case of polarization, of course, if we have people who are open-minded and have intellectual humility, and they have argumentative virtues such as willingness to listen to others, the problem of polarization will be mitigated, as if they have, for instance, temperance or prudence. It is less likely that they will get engaged in this hot debate that ends up polarizing the views within the group. Then, when it comes to suppression, we can think of intellectual courage. Informational influences will be less likely, as well as social influences, to happen if people have the courage to speak up in a moral sense, as well as in an intellectual sense, if they have the courage to speak up when it is a minority view, the view that they are holding. Also, we will be able to prevent problems of homogenization, for instance, of cascades, if you have intellectual autonomy. Then you will be less prone to just follow the lead of whoever it is who have spoken first. You will be able to form, in an autonomous way, your own view about the case, if it is, for instance, a trial, a court of appeals. And domination as well. If we think of a group, a deliberating group, in which people are civil and are impartial, and they are kind towards each other, this will lead an inclusive deliberative environment in which it is less likely that problems of domination will happen. So this is not the panacea. It doesn't mean that once we have these individual deliberators, then who are virtuous, we can be sure that we will prevent those problems from arising. But it is at least a first step in the direction of mitigating the import of these problems, and therefore a first step in the direction of helping groups reach epistemically valuable agreements. So I will just conclude in the 3 remaining minutes with a minute per objection, 3 objections, okay, that I think that can be raised against. And this is by far the less developed part of the paper, so I'm looking forward to hearing what you think about that, or perhaps other objections that I might be not discussing in the paper. And this stand out to me as three main problems. One is the objection from unintentionality. So the objection is an objection that has been raised against virtue being a corrective to individual biases in decision making. Many people have argued, and not only lawyers, but in psychology as well as in philosophy, that virtue can be a corrective, can play a corrective role of individual biases, individual cognitive biases. And the problem that has been raised against that is that there is a poor fit between biases on the one hand and virtues on the other, because biases are unconscious. They do not reach the level of consciousness, of awareness. We are not aware of seeking out evidence that confirms our view, the view we have. This is something that happens without us noticing, so it's non-volitional. Whereas virtue has this volitional component, which make it a poor fit to be a corrective for individual biases. And the same could be said at the collective level. So if those biases happen without us noticing, so it is not that the person who suppresses his views is so aware of the fact that they are doing that, or that she is doing that, because it's more likely a woman to do that than a man, not to say that they will not also cooperate to that. Or if the social advantage group members are giving more credibility to the views of those who are social advantage, and discounting the views of those who are not social advantage. Again, this is not something that is made at the level of awareness. So it is a social dynamic that happens below the level of awareness, and similarly, we might be able to say that virtue, because of that, is not a good corrective. However, I think that this is an objection that misunderstands the nature of virtue, because virtue is not something that is, the virtuous behavior is not reflective all the way down. On the contrary, the acquisition of virtue, since Aristotle, when it is successful, is a second nature. So it's habitual. And in that sense, it is a good fit to correct those biases that are also below the level of consciousness. The second problem, and this is a problem that is like, I've been working on virtue already for some time now, and in every domain that I try to apply virtue, this is a problem. So I hope, and I'm writing a book now on virtue, legal reasoning, and judicial ethics. Well, now, for so long I've been writing it, but hopefully it will be finished soon. And I hope to be persuasive in meeting the objection, which is the objection from feasibility. That comes up every time that virtue gets mentioned, which is like, yeah, sure, it will be wonderful. It will be wonderful if everyone in the room were virtuous, but they are not. So the remedy that you are just proposing is completely idealistic, and it is deprived of any practical implication. However, I think that this underestimates the extent to which virtue can be a potentially transformative force. We can inculcate virtue, and there is a lot of work being done in virtue education, so it's not hopeless to think that by the end of the legal studies or in CPD, in professional training, and if we were even more ambitious, at the end, when finishing high school before entering to university, if all the different educational steps were designed with a view to inculcating those traits of character, then it is not an idealistic picture to think that some people in the room might have developed, at least to some extent, some of the traits of character that may correct those deliberative biases. So there is some educational implications to recognizing the important role that virtues have in correcting biases at both an individual and a collective level. And secondly, one can turn to institutional design. And I know education takes a long time. So maybe we should speed up the process. Maybe we can think of ways in which we can design institutional environments and deliberative environments so that they foster behavior that is in accordance with virtue. So that the people behave as if they have the virtues, even if they don't have them yet. Okay? So you can get people to be impartial, and there is an interesting, but I'm Simon, an interesting empirical work trying to see how can we get jurors to be impartial, and then they realize that if you tell them be impartial, they just don't change behavior because they think they're impartial, so they change nothing, and they just behave the way they will be behaving anyway. But if you tell them in the instructions, consider that the opposite view is correct, then this has an impact on the way they behave. And with control groups, they were able to say that that specific instruction made people more impartial, at least in the sense that they made people behave as an impartial person would, okay? Eventually, with repetition, those people can perhaps develop the vision of impartiality, of genuineness, so that they might even have the virtuous motivations, which are required to possess a virtue. But even if they don't just yet have those, they will have a behavior that is in accordance with virtue. So there are many things, very many, that we could do in terms of institutional design to foster deliberative environments that propitiate virtuous behavior. And this can be design of the institution itself, of the rules of the institutions, the rules that structure deliberation. There is an impact on whether we require unanimity or we require majority, the composition of the group. For instance, when there is cognitive diversity within the group, there is no solid evidence when it comes to racial diversity or gender diversity. But with cognitive diversity, there is that increasing cognitive diversity mitigates the import of some of these deliberative biases. So maybe we could also do that. And then we could also design space. The fact that we have this in a round way is also, as opposed to perhaps a more hierarchical distribution of space, also enhances group deliberation. So there are some things from space to institutional design to rules that we could do to foster virtuous deliberation and therefore to mitigate the import of those biases. So it is not terribly idealistic. There are measures that can be taken in both education and institutional design to promote these virtues. And finally, an intriguing, I think, objection, and one that I'm not sure I know how to meet. It is extremely interesting, and I'm just scratching the surface of it, which is the following. It turns out that there is some evidence, particularly in philosophy of science, to the fact that vicious behavior on the part of some individuals enhance group deliberation. Okay? So there is an independence between individual virtue and collective one. Individuals who do not have a particular virtue might compose a group that nonetheless has that virtue. So we might have a group of people that do not have the virtue of impartiality, but the group does have the virtue of impartiality. And the other way around. There are situations in which the individuals who compose the group have some virtues that the group does not have. Okay? This poses a problem for this approach to mitigating these deliberative biases. Because particularly the claim that it is not only, if we were to say only that it might turn out to be the case that individuals have some virtues that the group does not have, this is a problem, but not such a serious one as to say that virtues can have this transformational value, in the sense that having a vice might turn out to be productive from an epistemic point of view at a collective level. For instance, having a stubborn person in the group, really someone who is not ready to concede, who polarizes, who is stubborn, sticking to his views and unwilling even to change them in the face of evidence. This in scientific context, and I think we can picture the same thing, the same situation in the legal one, has turned out to be productive because it has forced the majority within the group to refine the views and to find better arguments, not to really be able somehow to contest this minority member who has been so stubborn and uncompromising. It has also led, having this obfuscate scientist, has led the scientific community sometimes, they have prevented them from giving up prematurely, so avoiding intellectual rashness, some theories that if they have not had such type of opposition, they would not have, they would have abandoned them much earlier. So the fact that they were uncompromising and not willing to abandon them was at the end of the day a good thing. So that poses a problem to this way of thinking. And I have two responses to that. One is that it is not merely apparently, because this is really work that is being done now, so that we don't have really that much empirical evidence to back it up. But apparently, it is not just any bias that will transform, and it is not any configuration of, it's a specific configuration of biases and virtues. So for impatience to be a virtue at a collective level, it has to be teamed up with other traits of character, specific traits of character within the group, okay? So for instance, perhaps perseverance in some members of the group. So there has to be a kind of a specific vice profile, vice virtue profile within the group for vice to be productive at a collective level. And because I think individual deliberators do not know what is the distribution of vices and virtues within the group, I think the safest bet is to aim for virtue themselves. Because they are, there is obscurity as to whether that specific vice profile, which is actually rare apparently to obtain, we find ourselves in such a situation in which that particular vice profile obtains. So the rational attitude of the individual deliberator is to behave individually as a virtuous deliberator, given that he doesn't know that. This is one. And the other response I have is that even if it were epistemically productive, even if that were the case, I think that virtuous deliberation has also a moral justification. So it has moral value, not only epistemic value, in the sense that when a group deliberates in an inclusive way, with an egalitarian ethos, with a view of the common good, with civility and friendliness, they reproduce the type of social relationships and deliberative endeavors that we think are distinctive of a democratic polis. And in that sense, it has both political and moral value. And we will lose completely that moral justification if we were to promote vicious behavior in one individual with a view to achieving an epistemic end. To be continued, but these are like two ways in which this objection could be met. So, just to conclude, I have argued that individual virtues in deliberators are helpful for mitigating some of the deliberative biases that provoke groups a failure to agree within groups, as well as lead them astray, so lead them in the direction of agreeing on a mere pseudo-agreement or forged agreement, an agreement that is not based on the best reasons available within the group. I don't think this is the only way to the bias. There are other ways that are not virtue-based. I don't think either that this is the only problem for groups who are disagreeing. There might be other issues, there are other issues at stake which are unrelated to deliberative biases, but this is a strategy that can help us dispose of the problem in a big number of cases, so in a large number of cases, given the pervasiveness of these deliberative failures and its non-contingent connection with failures to agree and pseudo-agreement. But at the end of the day, I just want to conclude by noticing that it is not only that it's not the only strategy, but it is dependent on a much larger strategy, I have to say, because some of these failures and the ways in which the virtues are able to correct them depend, in fact, are epiphenomena of broader problems. So if there is domination within the group, the deliberating group, this is merely a reflection of the domination that occurs outside of the deliberating group. So at the end, an analysis of group deliberation leads us in the direction of apolitical epistemology and an exploration of what are the political implications of endorsing a virtue approach to law. Thank you, and ready for discussion.